It's Street Talk Live, the truth about how money really works and the secrets Wall Street doesn't want you to know. Powerful information to improve your life. Street Talk Live.
Street Talk Live.
It's all about you and your money. And now, Lance Roberts.
And welcome to tonight's edition of Street Talk. I'm your host, Lance Roberts. Max Gaines, of course, executive producer of Street Talk Live. Be sure and get by the website, streettalklive.com. Get registered for our weekly newsletter and join us on Facebook and Twitter because that's where we can keep you up to date with all the latest information that we've got coming out. These markets are crazy. We've got all kinds of stuff going on around the world. And, of course, even right here in this economy, we have an administration that's run amok on many different levels. This is not new news. But what I do have for you tonight is a very special interview with Dr. Woody Brock. Dr. Woody Brock, I've watched and heard over the last several years. I met him roughly about 4 years ago at the Strategic Investment Conference that we attended, and he really struck a nerve with me. He is intelligent, he is well-spoken, and he can bring things down to a very simplistic level of understanding that anybody can understand. Well, who is Dr. Brock? That's the question, right? I mean, is he just some guy out here that's just gotten a PhD in economics and he's just spouting out whatever bit of relevant rhetoric is running around? Dr. Woody Brock earned his BA, MBA, and MS from Harvard University. He then earned an MA and PhD from Princeton University in mathematical economics and political philosophy. He studied under Kenneth Arrow at Stanford University and the late John Harsanyi from the University of California, Berkeley, both winners of Nobel Prizes in economics. He has written numerous books. His latest book out right now is American Gridlock. It is on our website under the suggested reading list. I highly suggest you read this book. It is one of the most moving and intellectually set up books in terms of explaining where we are and the difficulties that we face as a nation going forward with some of the decisions that we are currently making in relevance to our economic strength down the road. Dr. Brock is also one of the world's foremost economists. He's the author of the new book, as I said, American Gridlock. He is also the founder and president of Strategic Economic Decisions, and it's a renowned economic think tank. Dr. Brock has spent more than 25 years counseling global corporations and other institutions who benefit from his in-depth analysis and the ongoing structural changes in the global economy. What's important about what you're going to hear tonight, and we are going to go in-depth talking about Obamacare, the impact on the economy, but also talking about the impact of decisions that are currently being made in relevance to the total economy by this administration and what the end results are most likely going to be and the outcomes from the decisions that are being made. And I tell you, this is probably one of the best interviews that we have ever done here on Street Talk Live. The reason is when you hear Dr. Woody Brock speak, he really brings it down to a very simplistic level. Things that are extremely complicated, he makes seem relatively easy. But what's really important here, and particularly talking about Obamacare, is solutions that would actually work to begin to turn Obamacare around, give people health care, and, of course, also solutions to actually fix the economy long term. You know, we hear lots of rhetoric from the media. What we don't get is a lot of solutions. And what you're going to find in both by reading the book American Gridlock and by listening to this interview tonight, which gives you kind of the Cliff's Notes version, is solutions that would feasibly work in a long-term directional trend for economic improvement. And that is what Dr. Brock brings to us tonight. So we're going to be talking to him in great detail about a lot of different things. I think you're going to really enjoy this interview. It will be posted on the website tomorrow. So simply go, if you missed any part of the interview tonight, simply go by the website, streettalklive.com. You'll be able to click the interview right there at the top under our interview section on the website and listen to the interview in its entirety. And it will be well worth your time, particularly If you spend time talking to anybody about the impacts of Obamacare, the potential for taxes, the changes to what patient care might look like in the future, this will give you the talking points that you need to discuss intelligently with somebody else about what the impact of Obamacare is going to be as it's implemented in the economy. One point I would like to make with you, Dr. Brock, is how easy this book was actually for me to read. Most books written about economics or politics are written at such a high level that they're very difficult to understand, and to get through one is like actually trying to get through a bowl of mini wheats without any milk. It's just virtually impossible. But with American Gridlock, you've done such an outstanding job of bringing down things to a level that anyone can understand and really understand what the impacts to them are going to be in the future from a lot of these economic and political decisions that are being made. And that was your point, right?
To be fair, people deserve a detailed explanation because these are not easy issues. And in my view, it's bad manners to simply say, oh, that's too difficult for people to understand. I want everybody to understand, and everybody can if you explain it clearly. So that's what I tried to do.
Because that's what they need to hear.
Well, they do, and I think they're eager to. I think people in general out there are sick and tired of sound bites.
Absolutely.
They're much too smart to know that complicated issues can be dealt with in a left-wing or a right-wing soundbite. And this is the tragedy of what the media, unfortunately, have done.
Thank you so much. And when we come back, it's more with Dr. Woody Brock. We're going to talk about Obamacare. We're going to talk about the economics. We're going to talk about how to fix the economy and employment. That's all coming up on tonight on this edition of Street Talk Live. And be sure to get by the website. As I said, streettalklive.com. We will have this interview posted in its entirety on the website so you can listen to it at your leisure. And more importantly, share it with your friends. Your friends need to hear what Dr. Brock has to say. Be sure and go by the website and get the copy of his book, American Gridlock. It is something you definitely want to read. It's a very easy read and something that you will enjoy and give you the type of insights you need about where we are headed as an economy. That's American Gridlock by Dr. Woody Brock. It's on the website, streettalklive.com. Be sure and send us your questions and comments. Also, join us on Facebook and Twitter so we can keep you up to date about your investments, your money, and what's going on with our economy. It is all at streettalklive.com. I'm your host, Lance Roberts, with Max Gaines. We'll be back with more Dr. Woody Brock on American Gridlock right here on tonight's edition of streettalklive.com. And welcome back to tonight's edition of Street Talk. It is streettalklive.com. That is the website that you can get all of your information about your investments, what you need to be doing with your money. But tonight, it's about the economy. It's about Obamacare, and we are very honored to have Dr. Woody Brock, the author of the new book, American Gridlock, Why the Right and Left Are Both Wrong, with us tonight, talking about the book, Obamacare, and, of course, the economy and how to turn things around. In your book, American Gridlock, what was your ultimate goal for writing the book, and kind of what brought you to the idea of writing it all together in the first place?
The question is a good question. I should say, maybe it's best to say, what was the frustration that drove me to write the book? And the frustration is that of yours and anyone listening in, and that is we are fed up with a government, not just a Congress, but a government that seems to be unable to act in a manner that solves our problems. Now, if I were a physicist and I'd somehow proven that the sun was going to burn out in 2 weeks and there was no question about it, I would not waste my time writing a book on how for that not to happen because you couldn't stop it. The book I would write would be about how to break out the champagne and caviar and celebrate. Unfortunately, in the case of the crises in the United States, the multiple problems we have, that people are aware of, there are answers. Not only are there solutions to our problems, but what is original about the effort I made is to show that the solutions do not have to be either right-wing or left-wing. That is to say, we don't need to be in the state of gridlock, where everything the right does, the left hates, and everything that the left does, the right hates. In game theory, we call this a zero-sum game, where everything I win, you lose, correct? And vice versa. Zero-sum games basically promote gridlock, which is what we have in Washington. what I was able to do using some pretty advanced ways of thinking, new thinking, based on new logics like game theory, is to show that you have win-win solutions to our problems, like entitlements, like the lost decade we're living in right now, solutions that can please both the left and the right. So for God's sakes, let's just implement them and do it. That was the main point, to show that there are answers that are not left-wing, right-wing, and that they can solve our problems, and that's the end of it.
Now, when thinking in these terms, and we're talking about obviously the frustration we have currently with all the different policies that are being implemented through the current administration, and of course now as we approach an election year, this becomes extremely critical and important here. This really kind of focuses on this recent passage of the Obamacare by the Supreme Court and by Justice Roberts, and implementing that as a tax versus a penalty. So, could you explain kind of your solution, which involves the extension of supply and demand to really demonstrate how the healthcare spending crisis could be resolved versus the way it's trying to be resolved?
Well, I think that's a very good question, because when you look out to the long run, and I think everybody now knows this, going broke at the individual level from medical bills that nobody can pay, or the nation itself now spending 18% of GDP on health care, with that number due to rise to 25 or 30%, which could mean closing the Pentagon, it's a real serious problem. It's really the greatest problem. I mean, Social Security, by retiring at 70 and by making some minor adjustments, we can keep Social Security solvent for the next 75 years. That is not a problem. But the medical thing is a crisis. So, the question you ask is a little misleading, because the question you ask is about the Supreme Court decision and the legitimacy of Obamacare itself. The Supreme Court saying because you can interpret this as a tax, it is legitimate. This is a very minor issue, in my opinion. You see, the real problem is, regardless of Obamacare, or at least regardless of the provisions of it, like whether you had to have that requirement, that mandate that everybody has to have insurance, regardless of all of that, the real question here is the expenditure of the nation on health care. Why, for the same life expectancy, are we spending 18% of our GDP when all of Europe spends 9%? We don't live any longer, but we're paying double. Something is wrong. Furthermore, if our 18% goes to 30%, we are basically down the drain. They won't fix the roads, there won't be a defense, and so forth and so on. There's only so much money. So what I focused on in my own work in the last 5 years is a somewhat different issue than the legitimacy of Obamacare. That nests within this, but it's a minor footnote. The real issue is, what can you do, if anything, to take the expenditure on health care in an era when there are going to be more and more old Woody Brocks and baby boomers and whatever, and take that 18% and get it back down to 10%, even though I also want more people to be covered, as the president does, and unlike the president, when I want more people covered, meaning they have insurance, I want something more, which unfortunately his plan does not do, and that is that when you use your insurance to call the doctor, the phone answers. Go to Canada. Go to certain European countries. There's universal care, so they say. The phone can take 3 years to answer. Doctors don't like it. They go out of business. So having access to the system is a Pyrrhic victory. It doesn't get you into that doctor's office at all. So my goal was to have more people covered, just like the president, and phones that are answered, meaning there are enough people there to take care of everybody, but also, and this is what is dynamite, to be able to not raise but lower the total expenditure of the nation from 18% down. This is incidentally exactly what happened to the costs of the telephone bill of the nation. To make the same number of calls, the same number of minutes per call per capita as 30 years ago, the cost has dropped 90%. The solution that makes it possible so to speak, to have your cake and eat it too. That is, more access, more availability, and lower expenditure is for the so-called supply of healthcare services to increase at a more rapid rate than demand. You have to be very careful here. It's back to economics 101 in school. You can't say supply has to grow faster than demand, because you may remember supply always equals demand. Always. Prices change so that the demand for Wheaties equals the supply. You have to be a little more tricky. So what we economists say is you have to let the supply curve from the textbook shift out more rapidly than the demand curve. It's a minor distinction not needed perhaps for this discussion. But the good news is, as I show in Appendix B of my book, American Gridlock, in detail, is that you show formally and mathematically that if you let the supply rise more rapidly than demand, which you can do easily through 5 steps that I've outlined, then the total expenditure of the nation is like a parabola in high school. It rises, peaks, and then falls ultimately to zero, just as in the case of telephone calls. So this is, to me, the important issue, not the particulars of Obamacare and whether the mandate is valid. I'm sorry to give you such a long-winded answer, but it is an important question, and it is not being properly addressed.
Dr. Brock, hold that thought right there, because when we come back, we're going to talk more with Dr. Woody Brock, who is the head of the Strategic Economic Decisions Foundation, also the author of the new book, American Gridlock, Why the Right and Left Are Both Wrong, Common Sense 101 Solutions to the Economic Crisis. More of that coming up next. And the question that I want to ask Dr. Brock is, what about the doctors? The important thing is that we have to have doctors in the system. And is Obamacare going to facilitate more doctors or less doctors? And what does that mean to your future health care? That's next on tonight's edition of Street Talk, StreetTalkLive.com. You can get this entire interview on the website. And most importantly, please share it with your friends. It'll be on the website tomorrow right here at StreetTalkLive.com. More with Dr. Woody Brock coming up next, the author of American Gridlock, right here on tonight's edition, StreetTalkLive.com.
It's Street Talk Live, the truth about how money really works and the secrets Wall Street doesn't want you to know. Powerful information to improve your life. Street Talk Live.
Street Talk Live.
It's all about you and your money. And now, Lance Roberts.
And welcome back to tonight's edition of Street Talk. I'm your host, Lance Roberts. Be sure to get by the website, StreetTalkLive.com. Tonight we are honored to be talking with Dr. Woody Brock, who is the head of the Strategic Economic Decisions Foundation and the author of American Gridlock, Why the Right and Left Are Both Wrong, Common Sense Solutions to the Economic Crisis. You can download the book off our website, StreetTalkLive.com, as well as get this interview in its entirety. Anything you missed will be on the website at StreetTalkLive.com. One of the big overriding decisions that has a big impact upon the future of America, our children, you and me, is the government budget and deficits. The deficits.
That's so screwed up. That's unbelievable.
Well, wait, let me get through the question here. Let's talk about the concept of government deficit and the highly problematic issues that it proposes here, and especially, is there a potential where a deficit is a good thing, or is it always a bad thing, which has been portrayed a lot by the media, or is borrowing dedicated more to productive investment better than it is to unproductive investment? And that's kind of an obvious answer. But just really your thoughts about our current deficit, where it may lead us, and why we are in the position we're in.
Well, these, again, this is spaghetti bolognese. Things are so tangled up. Notice in your question, you just distinguished between productive and unproductive investment. You did that because I wrote all about that in my book.
Right.
You do not read that once in the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal. It's all political. Right now, from the North to the South Pole, deficit is a dirty word, is it not?
That's absolutely correct.
It is a dirty word. You get voted out of office if you're the Prime Minister in Australia, if there's any deficit at all. The point here is people are anti-deficit, and hence many are anti-Keynes, and John Maynard Keynes sort of introduced the idea that governments in bad times should borrow money to put people to work, and in good times pay it back. What happened was governments couldn't resist borrowing in good and bad times, so the total debt of the country begins to rise from 20% of GDP to 30 to 40 to 100, and then the bond market says, oh my God, you've reached your limit. You're no longer welcome. We are not going to buy your bonds anymore unless, well, we want a 6% interest rate, not 2. And then the government goes broke because they can't roll over their debt at 6%, whereas they could at 2. Take Japan. They pay 0 to roll over their enormous debt. If that interest rate went from 0 to 4%, they say they'd be bankrupt in 4 years, the whole country.
Right.
So, deficits are terrible. Government abused Keynesian logic. Government said we'll borrow all the time. Now, the problem with this comes down to, and let's sort of step way back once again and take a more architectural look at the whole mess. Mr. President, you have a mess in your hand. The American people binged and borrowed for 30 years. Yes, they did. They overspent. And it's the morning after. They're deleveraging and drying out. That's Woody, Tom, Dick, Harry, Susan, and Melinda. Am I correct?
Absolutely.
Yes. We therefore have a big recession. In addition to that, we have the fact that complete incompetence on the part of state and local governments pushed them to the brink of bankruptcy. And incidentally, this is only beginning with all the public employee union payouts to come in the future. It's just beginning. That because of the mess at the state and local level, a sector of the economy which in bad times used to hire 650,000 workers has now laid off 700,000. Next, you have the fact that the housing bubble was so absurd and it blew up so badly that people have lost their belief and faith in housing as an investment. So housing investment, which puts people to work, is at its all-time low. You see what I'm saying? The leveraging, the deleveraging, the borrowing and binging for 30 years is over. The home equity loans are over. There's no state and local support. The economy, Mr. President, is a mess. Yes, Mr. Brock. Mr. President, what Keynes is saying is when the private sector is hurting and animal spirits, as Keynes called them, are low, the government sector must come in, pick up the slack, borrow, spend, and create the jobs until the sun rises and Woody, Brock, and IBM start spending again. Right? So this is the basic point. And the objection is, Mr. Brock, unfortunately, we've abused borrowing so much by having deficits all along that the bond market may do to us what they've just done to Italy and Greece and Portugal and say, we won't buy your debt. They will drive up interest rates, not by a little but by a lot, and we're cooked. We're finished. So, Mr. Brock, I know we ought to be stimulating the economy in the public sector, but unfortunately, we've so abused the ability to do so that we really can't do it anymore. Now, this view is standard. Paul Krugman's an extreme in the New York Times. He says, regardless, we have to stimulate and borrow a lot more and spend. It is astounding to me that nobody makes the point made again in one of the 3 greatest books in the history of macroeconomics, a book called Optimal Fiscal Policy by Kenneth Arrow and Mordecai Kurtz. Arrow, again, same man, Nobel laureate who mathematized Adam Smith and many, many other things. Total genius and a former teacher of mine. The point here is the following. I want you to think of when deficits are good, not bad. Take country A. Country A has a government spending of $4 trillion, that's us. all $4 trillion is spent unproductively, to use the phrase you used. That is, it's spent on interest expense, defense, transfer payments, Medicare, Social Security. There is no investment in the international, in the intercontinental, in the interstate highway system. Correct?
That's correct.
Good. The tax receipts are $3 trillion. If you have tax income of $3 trillion and you have expenditures of $4, you have to borrow from the children an extra $1 trillion. Correct?
That's correct.
And that just gets added to this debt, and the bond market gets more and more nervous, and the result can be much higher rates. So the world is clamoring and saying you must have austerity, you must stop this, but this is absolute nonsense. Consider country B. The government also spends $4 trillion. The tax receipts are $3 trillion. 3 from 4 means they too have a deficit of $1 trillion. No, they don't. The deficit is 0. And that is because I want you to think about the $4 trillion they spend. $3 trillion is spent unproductively on Social Security, interest expense, and the military, which, notice, is the number of the tax receipts. So current tax receipts fully pay for their unproductive expenditures. The fourth single trillion, 3 plus 1 is 4, the trillion missing from this is not invested in infrastructure, but, and this was the point of the famous Arrow Kurtz work, but is invested in the subset of infrastructure that has a positive rate of return on capital. Notice what a good capitalist I'm being right here.
That's right.
That's right. We have proposals for 23 bullet trains. Some will lose money, some will make. So you have an independent investment bank. Singapore model where all the people in it are paid $3 million a year, so none of them are going to get corrupted. They will evaluate all 23 bullet trains and publish on the internet and list the rate of return on each. So Nancy Pelosi's California train, if it has a minus 8% return on capital, she'll shut up and we'll never hear another thing about it. But if another train has a plus 8% return on capital, as the interstate highway system did, yes, we borrowed to build something that did nothing but make money. We borrowed to buy the Louisiana Purchase, and for $17 million, Jefferson bought half of America. Borrowing is good if it's productive. So my point here is, if the bond market knows that the money you're borrowing is for good things, the bond market loves you. We know this from this country, from Peru, from Chile, from other experiments. And often, the private sector banks, Goldman Sachs could get a group together and say, let us finance this interstate highway system. We know it's going to make money. Just guarantee this. So the point I'm making here is, for a nation that has not put a new roof on its house, for a nation with a leaky roof that has underinvested in infrastructure for 50 years, we have a very high rate of return on such investment. Very high. Switzerland, where everything is banking perfect, does not. They don't need all of this. So we need a Marshall Plan where we don't take roads and potholes, but 9 different forms of lagging infrastructure, electric grids, fracking infrastructure, all kinds of things that are known as public goods. And we need to spend a lot of money only on the ventures that have a high expected rate of return. Then you put masses of people to work. The bond market is happy, Mr. President. You can have your cake and eat it too. Now, a CEO of any company knows this is obvious. You don't call in a company expenditures on creating new mines expenditures. They are investments. So they don't get subtracted from income and show a loss to the company. It's just unbelievable that the government does not make this distinction between good investment spending and bad. So I'm sorry, once again, this is a little bit complicated, so I've tried to make it, sound reasonable.
No, I think you're very well in the ballpark here, and something that we've discussed a lot on our show with our listeners in the past. And when we come back, more with Dr. Woody Brock, we're going to be picking up with government spending. Is there a good way for the government to make investments into the economy where it actually creates economic growth? That's next with Dr. Woody Brock, right here on tonight's edition of Street Talk. StreetTalkLive.com. You can get the book right from our recommended reading list, American Gridlock, Why the Right and Left Are Both Wrong. Well worth your time to read. And, of course, most importantly, you'll be able to listen to this interview in its entirety on the website, StreetTalkLive.com. That is StreetTalkLive.com. We'll be back more with Dr. Woody Brock right here on tonight's edition of Street Talk, StreetTalkLive.com. Welcome back to tonight's edition of Street Talk. I'm your host, Lance Roberts. Max Gaines, executive producer. We are speaking with Dr. Woody Brock. He is the author of American Gridlock and, of course, the head of the Strategic Economic Decisions Foundation. And we've been talking tonight about Obamacare, the impact from the economy on Obamacare, and, of course, deficits. But this does bring up the idea about government intervention into the economy. This brings up one issue, though, that I would like to touch on with you.
Yeah.
Let's assume for a moment that we could get a president into office that agreed with you and said, this is what we're going to do. We're going to start spending massively, but we're only going to spend on productive investments. But at the same time, we have to increase our revenues, so we're going to impose a higher tax strategy. Because one of the issues has been under the current administration is that he wants to raise taxes on the wealthy. Of course, from the right-hand side of the street, we get the issues that, well, if you try to increase taxes on the wealthy, you're going to lower job creation, you're going to lower economic growth. So my question becomes, if we could start a deficit spending situation that was creating a productive investment, could you theoretically increase your tax revenue without damaging your job growth?
The correct answer is that the impact on GDP and job creation, given what we call the accelerator multiplier effect from investment spending, when you spend money on one contractor who hires 10 other contractors who then hires 10 other people, you have this wonderful sort of boom that results from Marshall Plan spending. This is well documented. The gain from that would far exceed any loss from, quote, less job creation due to rich people being taxed more. To begin with, it's not even clear that there is less job creation. This is a right-wing slogan. You never see data supporting that. Now, it is absolutely true that if you were to tax wealthy people at 80%, they can go on strike and close their companies, and then you'd have a loss in jobs. We are nowhere near that point in this country. So all I'm saying is, let's grant that there is an effect, a negative effect on job creation from taxing the rich more. And that's a very questionable assumption. The magnitude of that effect would be tiny compared to the magnitude that would result from a proper Marshall Plan in profitable investment spending. That's the answer. Now, the question of a flat tax, for example, and should there be a tax increase, once again, if we're following logic that says we should have a bigger deficit, borrow more, but borrow for the right things, you don't have to immediately, as long as you are investing in the right things that make money, you do not have to match that with a tax increase. A tax increase will slow down the private economy. You do see that.
No, absolutely.
So there's no point. I mean, I would agree with Krugman here, but he never makes the point about productive investment at all. I would say raising revenue through tax increases in the long run, as we all spend more money on medical and this and that, is going to happen. But for the moment, to get us out of this terrible mess where, at least in Europe, 40% of young people don't have jobs in 6 countries and can't get work, and in this country it's terrible, I am not sure we should focus on the revenue side yet. But this is true only if you agree we need to borrow a lot of money and spend it productively.
Right. And no, you and I agree on this, and I was making the case earlier about the tax revenue because it's obviously a huge issue. You know, we're facing the fiscal cliff here at the end of the year. Today, headlines out from the Obama administration that he wants to extend the Bush tax cuts only for those making less than $250,000. Of course, you know, tax issue is a big issue. I agree with you that if simply we start investing in productive investment, you will get a net increase in tax revenue from having more people to work.
Well, I mean, this is something you're pointing out that I missed. Of course, an automatic byproduct of the Marshall Plan type of concept is you have a boom in jobs and business and profits, and of course, that's how governments get out of recessions. That's how deficits fall. The construction boom under Bill Clinton in the Internet, what I call the rewiring of America boom, it was not housing, led to massive revenues that created the surplus of Clinton. He never planned on it. He told me. He never expected it.
Right.
The business boomed, and the government ran a bloody surplus.
Well, and this is my point. You know, we're focusing, as always has been the case, in my opinion. We tend to focus in our administrations on all the wrong issues. Focus on job growth. Focus on getting people to work. And you solve a lot of the other problems along the way.
This is what I have just done. I
Yes.
said, what do we do to create jobs? And what you do. Let me rub the point in one last time, because
Sure.
I didn't say it right. Let's start with what you're saying. I am the philosopher king. I want jobs, jobs, jobs. Okay. If I borrow in the standard way, the government, I borrow and do what we have been doing for 40 years, borrow and pay government workers to keep their jobs. Borrow for what's called transfer payments. And most of the Pelosi thing went to state employees.
Right.
You do in borrowing keep people in their jobs. That's good. Correct?
That's correct.
The problem is nothing productive came out of that to permit the repayment of the borrowing, so the kids are stuck with even more bad debt. Also, from a job standpoint, borrowing money to keep people in their jobs in bankrupt states does not create one new job. When you borrow the same $1 trillion and spend it on my Marshall Plan concept, the money this time goes to you. You are the master contractor, let's say, for this infrastructure project. There are 10 divisions of it. Each division, highways, roads, bridges, tunnels, electric grid, gets $100 billion check. Correct?
That's right.
What do they do with the money? They put 10% aside for a rainy day. They then hire 341 contractors who hire subcontractors and consultants. There's a new demand for cement, office space, carbon fiber, steel, and you have your famous Nobel Prize accelerator multiplier effect on jobs and income. It's night and day compared to what we've been doing for 40 years in this country of borrowing to keep people in their jobs. So if you start with jobs as a motive, you want my Marshall Plan. That's what I'm trying to say.
Right.
You want it, but you want it on productive investment, of which there's huge amounts, because when you have leaky roofs everywhere, you have high returns. That's a very important point.
Now,
this country is perfect for this plan.
we'll be back with Dr. Woody Brock right after this break, talking more about your money, of course, as always, but most importantly, something you don't hear a lot about. It's called game theory. Dr. Woody Brock is an expert in this area. Why game theory is so very important to this discussion. Dr. Woody Brock, the author of American Gridlock, right here on tonight's edition of Street Talk. You can download the entire interview if you missed any part of it at the website, streettalklive.com, as well as get a copy of the book. I highly suggest you read it, streettalklive.com. It's all about you and your money. Welcome back to tonight's edition of Street Talk. I'm your host, Lance Roberts. We're speaking with Dr. Woody Brock, the author of American Gridlock, Why the Right and Left Are Both Wrong. And we've covered a variety of things this evening, everything from Obamacare to deficit spending to creating a investment plan that would help create economic growth, a solution to our current economic problems. But now we want to address something you don't hear a lot about, and that's called game theory. And this is something that Dr. Woody Brock is a expert at, and can bring this down to a level to why it is important for you and I to understand the impact of why game theory is important to creating an economic outlook that will work in our economy. Dr. Woody Brock, and this really kind of brings us to the final point I wanted to touch on today, which is, in your book, one of the things that you talked about, and you mentioned this early on in the interview today, is talking about game theory and deductive logic. And it's all the things that you've been talking about. These are very reasonable, rational things when you think about it. Is, how does the government work? It is effectively a business. If you as the government, it has income, it has expenditures, and where it expends money and the rate of return it gets on those expenditures are very important to the bottom line of all this. But, can you kind of talk about a little bit about game theory and some of the different solutions that can cross the ideological divides that we currently have in our country?
Well, you see, game theory is, from a standpoint of philosophy of science, which is an interest of mine, Einstein's relativity theory and von Neumann's game theory, and they were the two, geniuses of our century, and they were the two first members to create the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, where they both moved. They're the two most important events of the century intellectually, along with the discovery of DNA and RNA. Game theory is a philosophy. It's a way of thinking. So when you ask me this, it's hard to say, but basically one of the things that game theory says, and every student now learns this, they learned it in the theory of evolution in biology and economics and political science, it's called the prisoner's dilemma game. Game theory shows the following. Behavior that seems to be rational is in fact often irrational. Let me put it differently. If you do what's good for you and I do what's good for me, we often end up screwing each other. If you're a prisoner in a cell alone, this is the prisoner's dilemma, and I'm another prisoner isolated from you and we've committed a crime, they will come to you and say, if you confess, you'll get out in 2 years. If he confesses, you'll be in for 20. If you both confess, you're in this, you're in that. And the point of this is, what's best for each individual to do is to tattle on the other. They both tattle, and they're in jail for life. Do you see that?
Yes.
Each did what was best for him in isolation. Had they been able to make a binding agreement together, everybody could have been better off.
Right.
Now, free trade is another example. Woody, free trade's terrible. I don't care what you say. If you let there be free trade, incidentally, I don't mean free, I mean fair trade, which with China we've never seen. They have screwed us all along the way, which is another chapter in my book, but we let it happen to us irrationally. But suppose we go back to textbook Economics 101. We read that free trade is good. Woody, it's not good. The furniture industry in my hometown here in North Carolina is going to suffer no matter what. They are absolutely correct. Game theory says, wait a minute. The theorem is free trade in all sectors of the economy, with all nations in the world, will have the impact that the gains to America and Iceland and Argentina and Timbuktu from fully fair and free trade are so great that you have more than enough surplus to pay off the losers in North Carolina. This is called in game theory making a side payment to shut up the people that will stop it from happening because they're a squeaky wheel. Do you see my point?
Yes, sir.
This becomes a new way of thinking about things, of how do you break a log jam. And basically, I'm not going to spend the little time we have left trying to say more specifics than that, but game theory is just a way of thinking that makes you look for win-win solutions. For example, in bargaining with China, China has, as you know, walked all over us. Their currency today is half of what it was in 1990. It ought to be 4 times greater, according to economic theory. They have raped the world. Game theory says this should not have happened because when this happened, the United States had, as I show in the book, 5 to 6 times the power, properly measured in game theory, than China. How could we, who were so powerful, let China walk all over us? And the answer is, in game theory, this is John Nash, you know, the beautiful mind guy?
Yes.
Who was with me at Princeton, and he made this point brilliantly back in a paper in 1953. He showed that if you don't want to have happened to us what China did to us, then you've got to make your threat strategy explicit and clear up front. You make China know up front that if they continue this behavior, and we're not going to back you into a corner, China, we love you, we like your joining the world, but if you're going to do this and not reform these 5 practices, by May the 1st, 5 years from today, you will have a 100% tariff on every good. This is like the doomsday machine that prevented Russia and America from ever going to war. Remember the movie Dr. Strangelove?
Yes.
We knew the thing would go off. So the Cuban Missile Crisis, they backed down and we never went to war. In other words, if you don't want war, make your threat strategy rigorously clear up front. But government today, the Hillary Clintons of the world, the notion of making an explicit threat would be politically incorrect. Am I right?
Absolutely.
And the point is, it's seen as sort of ungainly to do that. So China has just laughed its way to the bank, and we sit there basically apologizing for China and doing nothing. So game theory makes clear if you want peace, make clear there will be war unless ABC is done.
And
so this is a very different perspective than the perspective of Obama of be nice to Putin, be nice to everybody, hope they'll be nice to you. They won't be nice to you, and if we haven't noticed, they aren't.
Right. And again, Dr. Brock, this isn't a new situation with this administration. This has been going on for multiple administrations, and which is, the crisis that we're in today is not something that occurred overnight. This has been 30 years in the making.
No, excuse me. It's the trust fund situation. We all got spoiled.
Yes.
We thought we could have everything. We thought we could be nice to China and survive economically as well. Sorry. We're like third-generation trust fund people. It was too easy. We got too fat, did we not?
Absolutely.
And this is all part we've been talking about it. Congress voting benefits for people that the Holy Ghost could never pay for. I wrote about this 30 years ago. Policemen and firemen with pensions of $300,000 a year. Are you kidding? It was perfectly clear to me that Willie Brown was going to bankrupt California. I lived there for 25 years.
Sure.
I wrote about this. But nope. People don't. And now, of course, California is bankrupt. 100 cities are going bankrupt around the country. Meredith Whitney was right in her assessment. And, it was all predictable.
Absolutely. And of
Game
course,
theory is what has helped me make many of these predictions that I've made in my career. It just makes you think in a tougher way.
Right. Dr. Brock, I really appreciate all your time and that you gave with us today. Any comments that you just want to make in closing here, anything I might have missed that you feel is really important relative to your book?
My book's just an effort to say that there are win-win answers. I think the most important point of all, and we've touched on it, is when you take these big problems we have, like the jobless decade we're in now, or the entitlements crisis, the crucial point here is the architecture of the problem. And again, that's where game theory helps. Notice, I started off analyzing healthcare not from the standpoint, is tort reform good, or do we need the mandatory thing? I started with the whole problem. The problem is we're going broke for Medicare, correct?
Absolutely.
To not go broke, we have to take the expenditure of 18%, and rather than letting it go to 30% on healthcare of GDP, I want it down to 10. Now, I happen to have the analytical ability to mathematically think all these things through. That's me. I don't care who does it. Somebody can do it. And the good news is when you think about the much bigger issue of pushing that expenditure number down, you can then invoke the law of supply and demand in a new way, which is fully outlined in the book, and you say, oh my God, Mr. President, we can have effectively universal coverage and not have doctors retiring and not telling doctors what they're going to be paid, and the nation's total bloody bill actually is dropping, Mr. President. You see? So it all depends upon thinking big enough at the beginning.
Right.
We don't think big. You have your little war story about the Cleveland approach, and I'm mad about tort reform, and all these doctors thinking little sort of micro things. That's not what's needed. We're going broke. We have to look at that issue and work backwards. So that's what I tried to do.
Thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm sorry if I was too long-winded.
Thank you so much for your time. We look forward to speaking with you again here on StreetTalkLive.com. Of course, we want to stay in touch with you to keep up to date as to the developments of what's going on and the real impact that it's going to have on the economy. Dr. Woody Brock, the author of American Gridlock, Why the Right and Left Are Both Wrong, and very important. Read this book. It will change the way you think about the current economic environment and where we're headed. It's a fantastic book, and it's full of information in an easy-to-understand format that everyone can basically grasp and understand. You can get the book at the website, as well as download this entire interview on the website, streettalklive.com. That is streettalklive.com. You can follow us on Facebook and Twitter and subscribe for our weekly newsletter where we talk about very many of these same issues. It's all at the website, streettalklive.com. It's all about you and your money. Welcome back to tonight's edition of Street Talk. I'm your host, Lance Roberts. Max Gaines, of course, Michael Smith. And tonight we spent the show talking with Dr. Woody Brock, the author of American Gridlock, Why the Right and Left Are Both Wrong. Brought up some really fantastic points about Obamacare, the fact of deficit spending, why it's such a mess, and of course, real solutions to solving the economic crisis by implementing investments into the country that create believe it or not, a positive rate of return. And so what I wanted to do for a few minutes here, Mike, is just really kind of talk a little bit about the conversation we had with Dr. Brock, some of your takeaways. Was there anything in particular that really struck home with you that really jumped out, maybe something that you hadn't thought about before, or maybe changed your view on?
Well, actually, reading this book, I mean, it's amazing for such a smart man to kind of bring that into a common sense approach. And so reading the book, it's very encouraging because it is a common sense. You find yourself sitting there going, you know what, this makes a lot of sense. And the fact that he, takes politics out of it, which is so needed right now, because like he mentions, the gridlock is from the right and the left. Well, the left wants this, so basically the right's not going to want it. They're going to oppose it just to oppose it. But his solutions take politics out of the equation. And, Woody's very mathematical. I've been reading some of the works of Kenneth Arrow, and it's, very inspiring. But, I think he hits home with the infrastructure and talking about the, productive assets. You and I run a business, so we know if we're going to spend money on things that are just going to be, making sure we're compliant, that's kind of unproductive. So we're not really terribly excited about spending money on compliant things. But if we're going to add assets to, basically grow our business, then that's a productive asset. You and I are going to be a lot more excited when it comes time to do that. So it makes very much logical sense when he talks about deficits and taking those deficits and borrowing to put into productive assets. And he mentioned, highway infrastructure. He barely touched on it. I wish he would have touched on it more. But you and I talk about this a lot on the show is, natural gas. I mean, we could become net exporters of natural gas. The revenue sources from that would definitely fund all these pensions, all these teachers, the police, and everything out there. So that makes sense. And that is the way you grow an economy. That is the way you grow a business. And, that was one of the things I really, I'm glad he kind of hit home at.
Yeah, one thing about that he didn't really go into a lot of detail on. And again, there's always only so much time we have in the show. But, an important concept here for people to understand is that we are deficit spending. And, of course, the political rhetoric right now is, oh, my gosh, we've got to cut spending, we've got to cut the budget. And the problem is that you can only cut spending and cut a budget when you are running basically at full employment so that you can absorb those austerity measures. Trying to implement austerity measures in an economy that's basically drowning at this point, high unemployment, an inability to create wage growth, these type of things, and now you come in and start stripping those austerity or implementing austerity measures, you're really going to compound the recessionary problem. But by offsetting the austerity cuts in non-productive areas, for instance, we do some budget cuts in areas such as maybe the Department of Education, the Department of Energy, things that when we remove those from the government budget, it doesn't affect the economy.
Sure.
And offset those cuts in spending with investments. Yes, is it borrowed money? Absolutely. It's deficit spending, but it's deficit spending in areas that create, as he said, a positive return. So in the end, it turns out not to be a deficit spend. It turns out to be an actual producing asset, a productive investment.
Again, it's back to the business.
Yes.
If you and I want to borrow money to go expand our business and we borrow at a rate of 5, but we grow our business at 20, I mean, there's the positive effect. It's the same concept, and it makes a lot of sense. You asked one other thing that kind of did stick out, and it did. Anytime you listen to Woody, I mean, he's educating you, and especially his comment on Keynesian economics, what stuck out was that he said today they have really kind of just ripped off Keynes and what his intent was. And that's not something that I'm as familiar with probably Woody is, but he basically said it was during bad times you would borrow to kind of encourage spending, but what he said is just we just kept on borrowing and never stopped. And that makes a lot of sense. I think Keynes later on did probably intend that to be kind of the one trick thing that we kind of see now, but he is right. I mean, governments did take advantage of that, and politicians know that, hey, you know what, if we could tap into that, borrow and get the economy back on the right track, we're all going to get elected again. That's going to help for that election cycle. And so it did kind of take off and morph into a different phase than probably the original intent. And I thought that was a good point.
Absolutely. The idea from Keynes was basically that yes, we spend during bad times, but when you're back into a growth phase in the economy, you stop the spending, you get back to a surplus, so that the next recession you have, guess what? You can deficit spend again. The problem is when you're in deficit spending mode all the time, even during the booming bull markets of the 80s and the 90s, we were running big deficits, much bigger now.
Sure.
But you had no surplus to work off of to offset this recession.
And, I've actually been involved in politics when the Texas state had surpluses. And it's amazing because the mentality is here's all this extra money and everyone lobbying to get that money is unbelievable. Those were the days of Enron and the days of the Texas Lotto Commission. Everyone was lobbying to get that money and basically add more government programs, add different things, and basically they squandered that. I mean, the idea of that surplus is like a person putting an emergency fund aside and having that savings for when times do get bad. And you know what? Politicians have not treated it that way.
Well, and I actually was having this conversation just recently with my friend, is that when you look at the way that we think, and I actually talked about this recently on the show, saying, maybe the way our current political structure is designed is flawed. Because if we get the right guy in to do the right things for the economy is going to drag. He's going to get voted out of office, and the next guy's going to come in and reverse what he's done. But what he's done over the course of a longer period of time will help heal and grow the economy. But the problem is that he'll never survive long enough to actually see it work. And, this is the problem, is that all of our politicians live to the next election. So instead of doing what's right necessarily for the country and the economy, they do what's right to get them reelected.
Sure. Well,
keep the handouts going.
Absolutely. Well, think about it this. I mean, if you talk about, the 4 solutions to deleveraging, and one of the things you hear Mitt Romney saying is that he's going to come out and cut spending. Well, you're going to cut government spending, which right now is what's driving GDP. Well, if you cut government spending and all of a sudden you're not going to have a net positive inflow from businesses who decide, okay, you know what, I'm not scared anymore, I'm going to come in and start spending money, there's going to be a lag. And the thing is, I guess the question is, is there an education process? Can somebody explain that? Because that's going to happen, and you are right. They are going to perceive it. Oh, my God, look what he did. He's destroyed the economy. And in the current mess, there is no way out. There is no more easy way out.
Right.
We're done with that.
And I think the point, though, that you made is that the guy that's going to have to do this is going to have to be a guy that's elected that can come in and very clearly and regularly explain, this is where we are. This is what we need to do to get to here, to get to better. And this is what's going to happen in between. And I think the real issue is if the American public could hear, clearly explained, the situation that we're in, a solution. The problem, we all hear the problems, but nobody's ever talking about a solution. Right? They're always talking about, oh my gosh, this is horrible. We've got debts, we've got deficits, but great, what's the solution?
And that's why his book is phenomenal. I mean, if you really sit down and go through this and look at it as a resource base, he does address the how. And exactly how you need to do this. And look, Woody's, he's not just some guy that's, randomly out there. I mean, he's advising some of the most successful, firms and that's ever existed.
Globally.
Yeah, globally. And they don't do anything without his say-so. So what better a solution than this book for, whoever's going to be next president should pick it up.
But, and maybe that's the thing, is that we need to get that book in the hands of
We need to get that book out.
Exactly. And speaking of the book, be sure and go by the website. The entire interview is on the website at streettalklive.com. So you can download the interview, listen to its entirety, and please, I urge you, send this to your friends. Post this on Facebook, post it on your Twitter account, email the link to your friends. This is the type of information that we do need, as Mike said, to be getting out. People need to understand and hear that there are solutions to these problems, but unfortunately the path we're headed down.
But with the removal of politics, and that's the beauty of it.
Well, and this is the big thing. You and I are constantly talking about where we are in the economy. We talk about how it affects our investments. And the difference between being Republican or Democrat is irrelevant in this conversation.
Yes.
It is, how is the current path that we're following going to affect our economy, ultimately our jobs, our incomes, and our investments? That's what we need to know. And unfortunately, the path we're on is not a good one.
Oh, that's true.
So be sure to go by the website, like I said, streettalklive.com, and click on the link to download the latest newsletter. Most importantly, go to our recommended reading list. Right on the right-hand side of the website, and you can download the ebook for American Gridlock, or actually you can order the book directly from Amazon and have it delivered to your house in hard copy cover. See, I'm still a hard copy guy. I'm still not the ebook thing. Right?
No, I have one ebook, actually 2 ebooks, and a ton of other books.
I got to be able to flip pages and make notes in the
We're
margins.
old school ants.
Exactly. It's not going to change. And people say publishers are dead. I'm going to keep them alive all by myself. But anyway, get by the website, streettalklive.com. Send us your questions, your comments, your emails. Join us on Facebook and Twitter. Get subscribed for our weekly newsletter. It's all on the website. It's all free, and best of all, it's all about you and your money. streettalklive.com. We'll see you next time on the next edition of Street Talk. And welcome back to tonight's edition of StreetTalkLive.com. I'm your host, Lance Roberts. Max Gaines, executive producer. Be sure you go by the website, of course, StreetTalkLive.com. Send us your questions and comments. Most importantly, download this entire interview with Dr. Woody Brock, the author of American Gridlock, Why the Right and Left Are Both Wrong. It's on the website tomorrow. Share it with your friends. And also, go by the website, StreetTalkLive.com, and download his latest book, American Gridlock. It's a must-read to understand where we are in the economy today and what needs to be done to begin to turn things around to become the America that we all want it to be. Tonight with us, I want to continue with Dr. Woody Brock. Dr. Brock, when we left off, we were talking about doctors. The doctors that I've spoken to and that we've had on our show, that we've interviewed previously about healthcare, and you touched on this earlier, is that, the universal healthcare drives doctors basically out of the system. They can't make any money. They can't be compensated. What they get paid for a Medicare operation has dropped by almost 80% over the last 15, 20 years. So they're working longer hours to actually make less money. And under the potential structure of Obamacare, the way it's designed, we're going to see another migration of doctors, nurses, the residents migrating out of the system, not into the system. So my question becomes, how do we increase that supply? How do we shift that supply-demand curve forward in a manner that you're suggesting here when you've got everything in place to actually reduce the amount of supply available to the market?
Well, this is an extremely good question you've posed. You're the first person who's ever asked me that, and it's an excellent question because it will highlight the need for very clear thinking. What you're saying is essentially that the system that we now have, and including the new provisions of Obama, that surgeons get reimbursed less per procedure for them to, quote, save money. What this will do is discourage people from those areas of the practice, and they'll go into plastic surgery or sex change therapy or any of the things where the government has nothing to do with what you do with me. It's elective. And that's what the top Harvard Medical School students are doing. If you graduate with $400,000 of university and medical school debt, you are not going to want Washington telling you we're going to cut what you get per hour by 40%, correct?
That's correct.
Now, this is the crucial question. The crucial point. If you do what I'm talking about, you don't ever use the word cost control. There is no such thing. This is why cutting costs is a Trojan horse. You cut what you pay the doctors, as Obamacare will do. You think you've saved money, correct?
Right.
Yes, you have, but no, you haven't. This is the need for high IQ thinking, because the consequence of doing this is you so reduce the availability of health care, of doctor care, that the backward shift in supply ends up causing the overall price to go up so high that you end up having spent more than you did before you cut costs. You see what I'm saying?
Absolutely.
I care about total expenditure. I don't want to hear this word cost control. It has no meaning. Repeat. I want to drive that 18% to 10. You agree?
I absolutely agree.
You agree with me, and I want everybody served. So here we go. If you do what is necessary, what happened to telephones, what happened to making furniture, what happened to making cars, TVs, and everything but in medicine, if you shift the so-called supply curve outward by telling Harvard Medical School et al., having not increased the number of doctors you graduate for decades, now that we're all getting old, you will triple the size of your school, and we're going to give you time and help. And if you don't, we're going to withhold every grant to Harvard University, period. Government has huge power here. They can compel the universities not to have a monopoly and a cartel, but to start producing doctors and para-nurses, all the people you need. Secondly, 90% of the reason why you and I go to a doctor is for something so predictable, my Labrador Retriever can tell you what the prescription is going to be. Am I correct?
Absolutely.
Expert systems of the kind that, like an ATM machine, can easily be designed that replace those scarce doctor hours with machines, and you go in at 4 a.m. to Walmart or to wherever, into a closed room. The best experts on earth are encoded in a computer. You are tested by a machine. Blood is taken. You are talking to experts on the screen. They will tell you what to do. Out comes your prescription. And if you have any irregularities, you will be given another printout of which doctors to see in your zip code at what time they are available. You will leave and the bill was $5. For something equivalent, I paid $500 for a 30-minute visit at Christmas in New York City. This is what should be happening. Now, the combination of more supply and more productivity, the key is more productivity. The combination of this has the following property. It pushes the supply curve out. Supply intersects demand, correct? Prices are such that supply equals demand, correct?
That's correct.
What we're doing here is we're adding supply to the market. No one is going to be told we're cutting your cost. Government will not dictate fees. The invisible hand, the law of the market, the law of supply and demand is what will set the price of doctors. And there will be no doctors quitting because, quote, the government is paying me less. There will be no rationing any more than there is in Wheaties or bra manufacturing or table manufacturing. Do you see what I'm getting at here?
Yes.
The problem is government interference and government control.
And you mentioned this when we were going into this segment. You were talking about plastic surgery and which is probably one of the best examples of medical care, because over the last 5 years the cost of plastic surgery has dropped.
Yep.
But quality has elevated because
Correct.
of competition and free market. And
absolutely, the way it did, incidentally, in almost every single good you could name that you buy with your income.
That's right. And this is what you're
Healthcare
suggesting.
is the exception, where I spend $500 to go see a doctor about a sore throat on Park Avenue, and it used to be $5 in the same building when I was 6 years old.
Okay, so what you're suggesting here is that we should privatize healthcare across the board.
You don't have to. This is where the politics can wreck it. You don't have to privatize it. You could even have a universal care socialist system. I'm not recommending it. But you could have a one-payer system. And incidentally, the insurance companies, have you dealt with them?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, the system we have is terrible. All you do is get a runaround from insurance companies, all hoping somebody else will pay the bill, and you've just exhausted, and there's nothing but 800 numbers to call. Single-payer systems are actually very efficient, something that a lot of, quote, conservatives may not like to hear. My point is that I'm not so interested in is it socialized, is it privatized. I'm interested in letting the supply curve be driven way out. I want productivity to explode. I want machines to replace people in the 90% of cases where what's involved is very low IQ and an expert system can easily do it that I could build. I want more people in the specialties that are needed, like for older aging, geriatrics and stuff. I want the medical schools encouraged to produce far more graduates. Now, have you met any young people who try to get into medical school in America?
Yeah.
Have you heard the stories?
Yeah. No. Go ahead.
Well, my godson was captain of the Harvard crew. He did very well, had very good grades. He ended up going to the Bahamas to medical school. You can't get in. There are no medical slots. We're way behind because a cartel, which ought to be illegal, has repressed competition. I'm sure you know this.
Sure.
They love it when there are not enough doctors and everyone's waiting in line. But even the doctors now have said, my God, what have we created? 24% of us are going to retire in 20 years. Who's going to take care of the aging baby boomers? This is my point. Questions like that do not occur in the market for lampshades or Wheaties, do they?
No.
None. There is no rationing. The word shortage has no meaning. The word cost control has no meaning because expenditure falls mathematically as more supply and more competition brings about a reduction of prices. No one is told to take less. It's a very subtle distinction I'm making. But you don't think this way unless you say, what I want to control is the 18% expenditure on health care of GDP, and I want to drive it to 5%. It's a very different way of thinking than anything you read in the newspapers. It's much more abstract.
We'll be right back. More with Dr. Woody Brock, the author of American Gridlock, Why the Right and Left Are Both Wrong, Common Sense 101 Solutions to the Economic Crisis. Go by the website, streettalklive.com, and download the book. It's right there. Go to our suggested reading list. You can either buy the book directly from Amazon, have it shipped to you, or you can download the ebook. It's all on the website. It's ready to go for you. Also, make sure and share this interview with your friends. It'll be posted on the website for you tomorrow. If you missed any of this very compelling argument about where we are in the economy and what we need to do to fix it, it'll be on the website. This is the information that we need to get out. So more coming up with Dr. Woody Brock right here on tonight's edition of Street Talk, streettalklive.com. I'm your host, Lance Roberts. Welcome back to tonight's edition of Street Talk. I'm your host, Lance Roberts. Max Gaines, of course, here, and we are speaking with Dr. Woody Brock, the author of American Gridlock, Why the Right and Left Are Both Wrong. And we've been spending the last few segments talking about the impact of Obamacare, the consequences of where we're headed with Obamacare, and we've talked about ultimately the issues as we go forward with Obamacare, which is what we want to address now with Dr. Brock, which is now, how do we move to the next step, which is getting on, because we talked about reducing the expenditure, and that was a big point, 18 to 10. So we've solved that point by using more of the, let me just say, the plastic surgery model for healthcare in a lot of ways, increasing
productivity, and you increase the number of people going into it. Yes,
that's right.
And you let your nephew and your godson be able to go to medical school, which right now they're not.
But
they can't get in.
Right. Okay. And so now how do we get what was originally 30 million people that went to 40 to 50, now 60 million people that are not covered by health care, according to the current administration? How do we get these people now covered under your thought process?
Well, this is a very different issue. The question of an implication of what I just told you, an implication of shoving the supply curve out faster than the demand curve, is that the bills, just as the bill for the nation drops, so does the bill for the individual. Do you see that?
Sure.
So the cost of being insured begins to drop. I mean, just think of a system whereby rather than needing 9 tests that are redundant, you only need 1 test because of tort reform or something like that, which incidentally is a very good way to push the supply curve out.
Oh, yeah.
So tort reform can be shown to do that. It also pushes demand backwards because doctors now, since they can't be sued for $100 million, are not going to demand that you and I have 10 tests when one would suffice. Am I correct?
Absolutely. The tort
So
reform is a
the point
huge
here
issue.
The costs for the individuals drop along with the costs for the nation. Now, still, the nature of medical care is such that you have to have insurance. I believe in mandatory insurance. The reasons I do are not those cited by the Supreme Court. The reasons that I do believe in mandatory insurance lie in the most important article on the economics of healthcare ever written by the Nobel Prize winner Kenneth Arrow at Stanford many, many years ago, when he pointed out, and proved mathematically, I might add, unlike the people in the Supreme Court who wouldn't even follow it, that if you want a system that's efficient, and you and I like efficiency, do we not?
Absolutely.
If you want a nationally efficient healthcare system, you must have universally everybody paying to be in it. And the reason is that when you deal with uncertainty, this is called the economics of uncertainty, in which I was trained, then an optimal system, meaning an optimal medical U.S. system, requires what we call an optimal risk-sharing arrangement. It's all about risk-sharing. It's all about insurance, is it not?
Yes.
And what Arrow proved is you cannot have a system where you have a suboptimal risk-sharing because young and healthy people opt out and don't pay, and the only people who opt for insurance are people who worry about health care over 50. You can see what that will do to the system. Everybody cheats, and then they sign up for health care the minute they feel ill. You can have such a voluntary system, but it will cripple the efficiency of the overall system, and capitalism is about efficiency, is it not?
Well, that's correct, but isn't that the problem that we have under the current plan, under Obamacare, is that you have there's no penalty for pre-existing conditions, so you just go sign up for the health care plan after you get sick, and it's actually cheaper to pay the penalty than it is to pay into the health care plan.
Now you're dealing with politics. The point is, yes, the way they've made it, the penalty is, to be blunt, too low, and people will opt for the penalty.
Right.
You are correct. On the other hand, the government gets that money, and in principle, they will use that to pay for the health care that people get anyway.
But Dr. Brock, you know that you and I both know that any money paid in on the penalty is going to be squandered on.
You see, you're confusing issues.
I know.
I know that, and you know that, but notice this is a classic way to take attention away from the main point.
Okay, we'll get back
it's
to the
like
main
an
point.
architect of a building. Do not tell me about the plaster work until we have the frame in place.
Yes, sir.
The important point here is everybody is going to get sick. You don't pay for insurance when you are sick. It's a lifelong thing, and if you want to be healthy, repeat, if you choose it, you've got to pay for it. The difference with broccoli is by not buying broccoli, you aren't screwing other people. So don't tell me that we can't make people buy broccoli. We should not make people buy broccoli. But healthcare, as Arrow showed in this famous paper, and I have great respect for genius of that kind, is simply if you want a good system where good has the capitalist ring of an efficient system, you must have optimal risk sharing. That means everybody pays always. You may not like to hear that. Now, you could make it mandatory. I don't know the different ways of doing it, but I'm trying to make a point that's different from what the Supreme Court said.
Well,
the Supreme Court never said a word about this. They just said it's okay to do what he did because you can view it as a tax. To me, that is a minor argument.
Right. And so an efficient way to potentially do this is to set this up the same thing as, a Social Security tax on your payroll. Everybody just pays a function
yes.
Of their income.
And incidentally, many studies have been done by conservatives. And I, as you know from my book, which is saying drop all this left-wing, right-wing nonsense, it's not helping at all. But Social Security actually is a hugely efficient and very good system. Mm-hmm. Can you imagine leaving that up to 400 insurance companies?
Oh, yeah, no.
It would be a complete mess. So the point is, I'm conservative in my principles. I believe in an optimal allocation of resources. I am against waste. I love efficiency. But when you have a public good, like healthcare, with all these tricky things, meaning that simple market solutions do not always work, you have to think twice. Like if you let people contribute voluntarily to Social Security, you wouldn't be able to pay payments to people when they got old. So therefore, you and I have been paying it since we were 21 and went to work. Correct?
That's right.
It's sort of the same kind of thing. However, to be a little more sympathetic to sort of an opposing viewpoint here, Arrow also showed in this famous paper on the economics of healthcare that an optimal system not only requires that everybody be in it, but moreover, that it hurts a lot to use it. In other words, there's no first dollar coverage. He proved this mathematically. You don't get your hangnail removed free. You don't go to the doctor free. It hurts until you get real sick. And then it doesn't hurt. And everybody has catastrophic insurance, so no one can be thrown out of their home for health care bills, to which Obama is sympathetic. My point is, from a theoretical standpoint, in the most important paper ever written on the subject, you have A, you want universal coverage, B, you want people to suffer and pay for going to the doctor for smaller things so they don't waste money. But C, when they get sick and real sick, then they are covered fully and they cannot go bankrupt. I think those are perfectly reasonable points. You could add to that a point he never made writing when he did many years ago, and that is now that we're in the age of self-abuse, where people seem to choose to get obese and very fat, that they should pay even more if they don't meet certain health guidelines. So if somebody wants to basically become very obese, and the reason is indiscipline, well, they will pay even much more than you or I will for going to the hospital. Do you see what I'm getting at?
Absolutely.
So this is not some prissy little freedom for everybody thing. We're talking what's required for an optimal system. And what Obamacare never did is it was a political solution that said, let's win votes by promising, no pre-existing condition problem, coverage for everybody, la-di-da. It focused on access to health care. It never focused on supply of health care.
Well,
was Harvard Medical School and the other 72 of them penalized if they don't increase supply? My Labrador Retriever isn't so stupid as to think that you won't have a crisis if you increase demand without supply. Am I correct?
That's right.
Well, thank you. That's the huge problem with Obamacare, not the constitutionality of this little clause. But this is the level of thinking in America. Well, no one can think about the big picture.
Well,
the same is true with the lost decade we're in right now, where the kids can't get jobs. That's another classic crisis we're in, and the policies we're adopting are all wrong.
But this has been the problem of really not just this administration, but past administrations as well, is that they've all been very short-sighted, simply to what's going to win me a vote now, what's going to get me into the next election cycle, and what's going to keep people happy for the moment. There has been no real long-term view or landscape, anything going all the way back to energy policy that we haven't had in the last 30 or 40 years. It's been very symptomatic. It's been very symptomatic of that.
Well, this is partly true. It's not all that bad, but yes, indeed, there is always the emphasis on the short run to win votes. However, with all due respect, if I were a politician seeking votes in the short run, I would point out that to get votes in the short run, we need a good health care system to which you have access and in which the cost of being sick will not go up 600%. I am running on issues. The candidate, want you, the public, to have both short and long-term security. And to do that, we need to do ABC. We need to increase supply. Is there anything politically unacceptable about saying at the same time as you say, we're going to give you more coverage, that we're also going to make sure that the coverage is cheaper by increasing supply, that if we prescribe that everyone eat apricots and that you must have apricots, we're also going to see to it that the price of apricots falls in half? That's not a long-term thing, with all due respect. That's common sense 101. Am I right?
Absolutely correct.
Fine. So I don't agree that, democracy is hopeless. It can only focus on the short run. What we don't have are people who can make sense of the short or the long run.
Now,
this debate on health care is the classic example. No one discusses supply. It's unbelievable. The most fundamental law in the history of social thought, the law of supply and demand that even the pharaohs wrote about, has not been used by an administration with 7,000 economists working on this problem. It's unbelievable. It's total incompetence.
When we come back, more with Dr. Woody Brock about the economy, the deficits, the government, the long-term outlook for the economy. That's more tonight on Street Talk. Dr. Woody Brock, author of American Gridlock, Why the Right and Left Are Both Wrong. It's on the website for you to buy right now. Go to the website, suggested reading list, and download the book, American Gridlock. It is well worth your time to read. StreetTalkLive.com to get the full interview. And, of course, join us on Facebook and Twitter and send us your questions and comments. StreetTalkLive.com. It's all about you and your money.